A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my weird prompt. I am Corn Poppleberry, and as always, I am joined by my brother and our resident walking encyclopedia.
Herman Poppleberry, reporting for duty. It is a stunningly clear day here in Jerusalem, and I have been buzzing with excitement for this specific episode. Our housemate Daniel, who is currently sitting about 20 feet away in the kitchen, sent us a prompt that really digs into the tectonic plates of how we communicate.
It is a question that hits on something we talk about constantly in this house, especially living in a place where so many languages collide. He was asking about vocabulary size and linguistic nuance. Specifically, he wanted to know why some languages, like English, seem to have these massive, sprawling dictionaries that feel like they could crush a small child, while others, like the Hebrew we hear at the market every day, seem much more compact and streamlined.
It is the classic quantity versus quality debate, but applied to the very tools we use to think. And of course, Daniel brought up the heavy hitter of linguistic myths, the Inuit snow example. You know the one. The idea that Eskimo or Inuit languages have dozens or even hundreds of words for snow because they live in a frozen landscape. It is one of those facts that everyone learns in middle school, but as we are going to see, the reality is far more complex and, honestly, much cooler than the myth.
But before we get into the weeds of snow and syntax, I want to start with a provocative question that sits at the heart of Daniel's prompt. Does having more words actually make you a better thinker? Does a massive vocabulary give you a more nuanced perception of reality? Or are you just being more verbose? Is the person with 100,000 words in their head seeing a more colorful world than the person with 10,000?
That is the million-dollar question, Corn. It touches on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which we will definitely break down later. But to start, we have to define what we actually mean when we talk about vocabulary size. It is not as simple as counting the entries in a book.
Right, because if you just look at the numbers, it looks like a blowout. The Oxford English Dictionary, for instance, contains approximately 171,476 words in current use. That sounds like an unbeatable number. It makes English look like this absolute behemoth of expression. But is that a meaningful metric for linguistic power?
Not necessarily. When linguists look at this, they distinguish between a language's total lexicon, which includes every obscure technical term for a specific type of screw or a rare tropical disease, and its core communicative vocabulary. Most English speakers only use about 20,000 to 30,000 words in their daily lives. So, while the attic of the English language is stuffed with 170,000 items, we are mostly just hanging out in the living room with the same 20,000.
So, why is the English attic so much bigger than everyone else's?
Because English is a vacuum cleaner language. It is what we call an analytic language with a massive history of borrowing. Because of the history of the British Isles, we have this Germanic base, then a massive layer of French after the Norman conquest in 1066, then a huge influx of Latin and Greek during the Renaissance. For almost every concept, we have three different options. We have ask, which is Germanic and feels earthy. We have question, which is French and feels formal. And we have interrogate, which is Latin and feels clinical.
We have this massive redundancy. We can choose the vibe of the word based on its historical origin. But that brings us back to the core of Daniel's question. Does that make us more nuanced? Or are we just carrying around three different hammers for the same nail?
That is where the comparison to a language like Hebrew becomes so fascinating. We have talked about Hebrew in various contexts, including back in episode 1031 when we discussed the evolution of the script, but its vocabulary structure is the polar opposite of English. Hebrew is a high morphology language. Instead of borrowing a new word for every new idea, it uses a root-based system called a shorshish.
I see this in action every day here. You take a three-letter root, like KTB, which is generally related to the concept of writing. From that one genetic core you build to write, which is liktov. You build a book, which is sefer. though that is a different root. But let's stay with KTB. You get Miktar for a letter, guitar for a reporter, Katavet for an address, and Haktava for a dictation. It is all coming from the same three letters.
So, if you were to count the words in a Hebrew dictionary, the number looks much smaller than the English one. But the communicative power is identical. The language is just more modular. I like to think of it as the difference between a box of pre-built Lego sets and a giant bucket of individual bricks. English gives you the finished castle, the finished pirate ship, and the finished space station. Hebrew gives you the bricks and the mathematical instructions to build whatever you need on the fly.
That is a great way to put it. It is storage versus computation. In English, I have to memorize reporter, address, and dictation as three separate, unrelated labels. In Hebrew, I just have to know the root KTB and the pattern for profession or location.
And this leads us to a really interesting technical point regarding modern technology. If you look at how large language models, like the ones that power AI, handle different languages, you see this lexical density problem in real time. It is called tokenization.
I have heard you nerd out about this before. Explain it for the rest of us.
Okay, so AI models do not read words the way we do. They break text into tokens, which are chunks of characters. In English, because the words are mostly standalone units, a token is often a whole word. Apple is one token. But in a high morphology language like Hebrew, or an agglutinative language like Turkish, the model has to break the words into tiny pieces to understand the root and the grammar. A single Hebrew word might be 3 or 4 tokens because it contains the prefix for and, the prefix for the root, and the suffix for plural.
So, the efficiency of the language for a human brain, which loves patterns, is actually a complexity for a machine that has to calculate every fragment.
Precisely. It makes it much harder for AI to process these languages accurately because the meaning is distributed across the word rather than being contained in a single label. But let's get back to the snow myth Daniel mentioned, because that is the ultimate example of this counting problem.
Right. The idea that the Inuit have 50 or 100 words for snow. This started with Franz Boas in 1911. He was an anthropologist who observed that the Inuit had several distinct roots for snow, which makes sense if you live in the Arctic. But the reason people think they have hundreds of words is because those languages are polysynthetic or agglutinative.
Agglutination is such a great word. It sounds like something that happens to your blood, but it is actually a linguistic superpower. In languages like Turkish, Finnish, or the Eskimo, Aleut languages, you add suffixes and prefixes to a root until a single word becomes what we would consider an entire sentence in English.
So, if an Inuit speaker says a word that means the snow that is falling softly on the igloo while the wind is blowing from the north, is that one word or a sentence?
To them, it is one grammatical unit. If you use the logic of counting words, then yes, they have an infinite vocabulary because you can always add another suffix. But they do not have 50 different roots for snow. They have a few roots and then a very sophisticated system for describing the state of that snow. It is not that they have a bigger dictionary, it is that their grammar is baked into the words themselves.
This really challenges the idea of nuance. If I have to choose between shimmer, glimmer, glisten, and glow in English, am I perceiving light differently than someone who uses one root for light, but adds a suffix for intensity or movement?
That brings us to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or linguistic relativity. The strong version of this theory, which says that language determines X thought, has been largely debunked. If your language doesn't have a word for blue, it doesn't mean you see the sky as gray, your eyes still work. But the weak version, which suggests that language influences chi, our focus, is very much alive.
It is like a mental habit. We touched on this in episode 845, The Weight of Words, where we looked at how cultural context dictates which words a language chooses to prioritize. If your language requires you to specify the source of your information, like some Amazonian languages where you have to use a different verb ending if you saw something versus if you just heard about it, you become much more attuned to the reliability of information.
It is not that you can't think about it in English. It is just that English doesn't force you to. In English, I can just say, "It is raining." In another language, I might be forced to say it is raining and I can feel it on my skin, or it is raining and I can see it through the window. That is a form of nuance that has nothing to do with the size of the dictionary and everything to do with the requirements of the grammar.
So, let's move this from the technical to the beautiful. How does this manifest in world literature? Daniel asked how this plays out in literary traditions. If you have a massive vocabulary like English, does that change the texture of the stories we tell?
It absolutely does. Think about the English literary tradition. Because we have this massive, redundant vocabulary, we have a tradition of lexical maximalism. Look at someone like James Joyce. In Ulysses, he uses over 30,000 unique words. He is using the vastness of the English vocabulary to create this incredibly dense atmospheric texture where every object has a highly specific, often obscure name. He is showing off the attic of the language.
And then you have the opposite end of the spectrum, even within English. You have Ernest Hemingway. He is writing in the same language as Joyce, but he uses a very small core vocabulary. He is almost trying to strip English down to a high morphology feel. He wants the weight to be in the simple verbs and the cadence of the sentences rather than the adjectives.
Right. But then look at modern Hebrew literature. Writers like Amos Oz or A.B. Yehoshua. Because Hebrew is built on those roots we mentioned, the prose feels very connected, in a way English can't replicate. When you read a sentence in Hebrew, the words often share the same linguistic DNA. It creates a sense of internal resonance.
Give me an example of that.
Okay, so in English, the words for vision, prophet, and appearance all sound completely different. They come from different roots. But in Hebrew, they all share the root rah, which means to see. So, every time a Hebrew writer uses the word for prophet, the reader subconsciously feels the connection to the physical act of seeing. The spiritual and the physical are linguistically tethered. That is a level of nuance that has nothing to do with having more words. It is about the depth of the connections between the words you already have.
That is a profound distinction. It is like English is a wide, shallow lake, and Hebrew is a deep, narrow well. English covers more surface area with its labels, but Hebrew goes deeper into the essence of the concept through its roots.
That is a perfect analogy, and it leads to a massive challenge in translation. When you translate from a high lexicon language like English into a high morphology language, you often lose that vibe selection. If a translator is moving a text from English to Hebrew, they might find 3 different words for anger in the English version, maybe miffed, irate, and apoplectic. In Hebrew, they might only have 1 or 2 primary words for anger.
So does the Hebrew reader lose the nuance?
Not necessarily. The translator just has to work harder. They have to use context or adverbs or change the shape of the verb to recreate that feeling. The nuance isn't prepackaged into a single word like it is in English. It has to be assembled by the writer. It is like the difference between buying a pre-mixed color of paint versus mixing it yourself from primary colors. You can reach the same shade of lavender, but one person just grabs the lavender can, and the other person carefully balances the red and the blue.
I love that. It makes me think about the snow thing again. The reason the myth persists is that it feels intuitively true. We want to believe that people who live in extreme environments have more of that environment in their heads. But the reality is that any specialist has more words for their field. A computer programmer has 50 words for code. A carpenter has 20 words for wood. A lawyer has 100 words for liable.
It is about utility. Language is a tool, and we sharpen the parts of the tool we use most often. But the breadth Daniel is asking about isn't just about utility, it is about the texture of thought. I think we should look at the cognitive trade-offs here. If you have a massive vocabulary, the burden is on your memory. You have to learn and store thousands of unique, arbitrary labels. If you have a high morphology system, the burden is on your processing. You have to understand the rules of how to combine the pieces.
That is a really interesting way to look at it. Storage versus computation. And this brings us to the permanent ink concept we discussed in episode 799. Your first language sets your mental patterns. If you grow up with a storage-heavy language like English, learning a logic-heavy language like Arabic or Hebrew feels incredibly alien. You keep looking for the word for something, and your teacher keeps telling you, no, just take the root and apply this pattern.
I have seen you go through that frustration, Corn. You want the shortcut, the single label. But once you understand the engine of a root-based language, you gain a different kind of freedom. You can be a neologist much more easily. In English, if I make up a word, I have to hope it sounds right or that people catch the reference. In Hebrew, if I apply a standard verb pattern to a new root, it is instantly intelligible to everyone. It is like a mathematical formula.
So let's talk about the widest vocabularies. If we had to crown a winner, who would it be?
It is almost impossible to answer because of the definition of a word. If you count every possible agglutinated combination in a language like Turkish or Finnish, the vocabulary is technically infinite. You can just keep adding suffixes. But in terms of dictionary entries, English is usually cited as the largest because of its history as a global vacuum cleaner. Some estimates for Korean or Japanese are also massive because of how they incorporate Chinese characters alongside their own systems and modern loanwords.
It is like asking who has the most stuff. It depends on whether you count the junk in the attic or just the furniture in the living room.
And we have to talk about the future of this too. As we move toward a world dominated by AI and global communication, are we seeing a lexical flattening? This is something that worries me.
You mean like global English?
Yes, we are seeing a version of English emerge that is very simplified. It is analytic to the extreme, simple words, simple structure, very little of that flavor or texture we talked about. And when AI translates other languages, it often normalizes them to fit that global English style. We are losing the spice of the original cuisine.
It is like every restaurant in the world starting to serve the same fusion food. It is fine, it is edible, but you lose the specific heat of the original dish.
Which is why I think there is going to be a renaissance of interest in these high morphology and highly specific languages. People are going to crave that depth and that connection that you get from a root-based system or an agglutinative one. They're going to want the permanent ink of language again, not just the pencil sketch of a simplified vocabulary list.
So, to answer Daniel's question, the languages with the widest vocabularies are often just the ones that are the best at borrowing or stacking. But the nuance doesn't come from the width, it comes from the depth of the structure. Whether it is the shorish in Hebrew, the diminutives in Russian, where you can change the emotional tone of any noun just by changing the ending, or the agglutination in Inuit, every language has its own way of being infinitely nuanced.
It really is about how you use the tools. I think the big takeaway for me is that we should stop counting words and start feeling the structure. If you are a listener and you have ever felt like you could not find the right word in your native language, maybe it is because your language's nuance is located in the grammar or the tone, not just the dictionary entry.
That is a really empowering thought. It means we aren't limited by the size of our dictionary. We are limited by our understanding of the system.
Beautifully said, Corn. I think we have covered the ground Daniel wanted us to explore. We went from the snow myth to James Joyce to the Shoresh to the future of AI.
It has been a blast. And hey, if you've been enjoying these deep dives into the weird world of language and ideas, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other curious people find the show.
It really does. We love seeing those reviews pop up. And remember, you can find our entire archive of over 1,000 episodes, including the ones we mentioned today, at myweirdprompts.com. There is a search bar there, so you can look up any topic we have covered in the past.
Yeah, check out the website, and if you have a weird prompt of your own, there is a contact form there too. We might not live in the same house as you, but we love hearing from our listeners.
Thanks to Daniel for the prompt, even though he is probably just in the other room right now waiting for us to finish so we can eat lunch.
He probably is. All right, this has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn Poppleberry.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. We will see you next time.
But before we go, Herman, I have to ask, if you had to pick one language to think in for the rest of your life, based only on its texture, which would it be?
Oh, that is tough. I think I would go with a high agglutinative language like Finnish. There is something so satisfying about the idea of building these massive, complex structures out of a single root. It feels like architectural thinking. What about you?
I think I would stick with something lexically dense like English, but specifically the maximalist version. I like having 10 different ways to say tired depending on exactly how my sloth self is feeling that day.
Fair enough. There is a shimmer for every mood.
Alright, thanks for listening, everyone. We will be back soon with another prompt.
Until then, keep exploring the nuances.
So, I was thinking about how this applies to our own lives here in Jerusalem. We live in this incredible linguistic collision zone where you have the ancient root system of Hebrew, the incredibly complex morphology of Arabic, and then this layer of modern English and Russian and everything else. It is like living inside a giant linguistic experiment.
It really is. You hear it at the market every day. People are switching between these different operating systems mid-sentence. They will use a Hebrew root but give it an English-style vibe, or use an Arabic expression because it has a weight that the Hebrew equivalent just doesn't have. It is code switching, but on a deep structural level.
It makes me wonder if polyglots, people who speak many languages fluently, actually have a larger mental space, or if they are just better at repartitioning their brain to fit the different systems. We should check out episode 1045, The Polyglot Mind, if anyone wants to go deeper on that.
Definitely. The hyperpolyglot is like a master musician who can play 10 different instruments. They are not smarter than the person who plays one instrument perfectly, but they have a different range of expression. They can choose the instrument that fits the emotion.
I think that is the ultimate goal of language, to find the right instrument for the moment. Whether you have 100,000 words or just a few thousand roots, the nuance is in the performance.
Beautifully said. I think we have hit our target for today. I'm going to go see if Daniel has any more weird prompts for us in the kitchen.
He probably has a list a mile long. Alright, thanks again, everyone. This has been my Weird Prompts.
Take care, and keep those dictionaries handy, or just learn your roots.
Or just be a sloth and take your time with the words you have.
That works too. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Wait, one last thing, Herman. Did we ever actually answer which language has the widest vocabulary? We talked about English being huge, but is there a winner?
Like I said, it depends on the counting method. If you go by the number of entries in a standard dictionary, English is usually at the top with over 600,000 entries if you include obsolete words. But if you count potential words in an agglutinative language, the number is literally infinite. So, English wins on historical hoarding, but languages like Turkish or Inuit win on generative capacity.
I like that. English has a very crowded attic.
It really does. It is a hoarder's language. But that is why we love it.
Alright, now we are really done. Thanks for the extra nuance, Herman.
Anytime. Let's go get some coffee.
Sounds good. My Weird Prompts is a production of the Poppleberry Brothers. Find us on Spotify and at myweirdprompts.com.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts.